All right, y'all. We're recording, and we're going to cover some key areas tonight, like we usually try and do. And I want to again, as we learn the events, I want to lock in the core principles. That's really, to me, what's most important. That everybody on this class owns the core principles, whether they be related to this perek in Yehoshua or all over the Tanakh. So that's the approach we'll continue to take. Now, let's start with one of the more straightforward ones. When we hear the concept en mukdam u'meuchar b'Torah, en mukdam u'meuchar b'Torah, what does that mean?
There's no order.
There's no order. And what is the lack of order? What's the message behind the lack of order? Or let me qualify it a little bit. It's a lack of chronological order, right? A lack of chronological order. Now, when we say that Hakadosh Baruch Hu wrote the Torah deliberately in a way to preclude chronological rigor, chronological seder, what's the main point we're making? And then we'll drill down. Why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu write it this way? Zeke, what do you got?
Because there wasn't any, he didn't want to place any specific importance on something that may have happened before something else, or that he wanted to cast that aside, I guess.
Okay, good. So he doesn't want to rank them in terms of
ranking. Yes, that's the word I was looking for.
Ranking. Yeah. What else? Come on, Rachel, what do you got? Why no chronological order? By design.
Aren't the stories like when they're next to each other, they're usually connected somehow?
Yes, so good. So we will connect certain stories. Beautiful. We want to make the point, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to make the point that this is not a history book. It's not a history book, it's a life book. And therefore, stories will be moved around in order to create adjacencies, in order to build lessons. So if we were writing a history book, or we were writing a direct chronology of X, we would have to apply the rigors of order, date, time, hour, Good? Mm-hmm. But being that that's not the goal is for me to look at this book today, 10 years from now, 50 years from now, my own life, and on and on and on, in my children's lives and so on, and be able to learn current lessons, many of which are built, as you said, Rachel, as a result of the adjacencies. So the adjacencies are extremely important. So as we
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
But it goes in chronological order, in regard to their birth and the people, right? So Absolutely. It's just within their lives that it's changed. No, these stories all come after Abraham.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So generally speaking, absolutely, you're right. There's generally speaking a chronological order. Absolutely. It's not absolutely random.
Right.
It's just a book of ideas and topics that are in the order of the topic. But within the storyline, we're going to deliberately move things in order to build an idea. So let's take the case here with where we're starting in the beginning of Perek Het of Yehoshua. It says, Az yibanei Yehoshua mizbeach laHashem. We'll talk about the wording in a few minutes. But we're now at a point where Bnei Israel have crossed the river and have already waged 2 wars. The second of which, if you remember, the war on Ai, was dampened by the fact that Ahan stole from the Herem, from the Hekdesh, from the sanctified stuff in Yericho. And therefore, that was a multi-tiered battle and not what it should have been, a one-shot and you're out thing. After those 2 battles, it says, Yehoshua builds a Mizbeach and they sacrifice on that altar. And right after that, it says that they write the entire Mishneh Torah, which we say is either the highlights of the Torah, maybe the 10 Commandments, or maybe the book of Devarim, on these giant stones near where they were camped. And then it says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe to split the tribes, some on Had Gerizim and some on Had Eval. And he repeats to us what happens when the Jewish people keep the commandments and what happens when the Jewish people don't keep the commandments. Now, right after these three grouped events are spoken about, it says, wait a minute, this all happened before these two wars. This all happened immediately when Bnei Israel crossed the river and ended up in the land. So we have three events grouped together that happened in sequence of each other, but happened, let's say, a handful of weeks or months before. So the Navi goes out of his way to skip these events after the Jordan River splits and move them to now. Good? We'll know about why in a minute. Now, so let's lock in the headline. Rachel, to qualify what we're saying along the lines of what you're saying, in the big picture, yes, things follow a chronological order. But in the more local picture, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will deliberately himself tell the story at a later period of time or an earlier one, or instruct the Navi to do that, the prophet to do just that. Okay, so far? Hold that, we're going to come back to it. Now, in the beginning of this story, it says, Az Yibneh Yehushua Mizbeach. Az Yibneh Yehushua Mizbeach. What does that mean?
So, right?
Huh?
And so he built the Mizbeach, right?
And so,
He will
come on,
build.
give me
He's
more.
going to build.
It's the same like Az Yashir.
Super. It's the same as Az Yashir. Beautiful. What do we got? What does Az Yashir tell me? That what?
It's
Az
he
is
did
what?
he did something in the past, and then Yibana he will build.
Right. So Az Yashir, the language is blatant. It says, then they will sing. What do you mean? It should have said Az Sharu. Then they sang. Az Yashir means then we will sing. So it's past, future, deliberately juxtaposed as it is. And how do we explain it, Serene, in the story of right after the splitting of the sea, when we have the words Az Yashir Moshe Bnei Israel, what do we say?
We're saying that this event is timeless. It happened. It'll happen again.
Excellent. That this is what happened, and this is what will happen. Now, our rabbis go even further over here, and they say, Az Yivneh Yehoshua Mizbeach, then, past tense, Yibneh, future tense. And they take a giant leap here, and they say something that you shake a little bit, because we know we generally don't say this. Any thoughts on that? How do you think they explain this? Az, past, Yibneh, future. It's a hard one. What do you think? Any thoughts? Any guesses?
What is it talking about again?
Okay, he's talking about right after the splitting of the Jordan River, where we don't mention the story then, as I described. We mention it now, and I'm going to tell you when now is in a few minutes. It says, Az Yivneh, then Yehoshua will build a Mizbeach LaHashem Elokei Yisrael v'Har Eval. Then he will build Kasher Siva Moshe Eved Hashem et Bnei Israel. The way that in exactly the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu described it to Moshe that it should be built. Now rabbis go very far here. They say that the past future here describes the afterlife. And is a remez to say that when a person builds here, then in the now, will go with him to that next stage. So what he did is what he will be. What he did is what he will be blessed for. Now, We know that. We all hold by that. So why is that such a big deal? Why is that a big deal? Because we have another rule, and it's an important rule to know and to own. We never, in quotations, reference Olam Haba in the Torah. We never do it. We don't do it. Let's say that again. It's a shocker, but it's very important. And that's why some people pushed back on it and said, that's a creation of our own minds. You know, it's the opiate of the masses extension, because we need a way to live through this world and all of the challenges it brings. So we created this thing. Okay. We know obviously that's not the case, but we have a rule that you will not get a direct reference to Olam Haba in the Hamisha Chumshei Torah, or generally speaking in Nach. You will not.
We're saying it's a rule that we created the rule, or we're saying that there's not any other reference besides this one in the Torah, in the Tanakh.
Very good, Zeke. There is no direct reference to Olam Haba in the Tanakh. Zero. The only references are like the Dirisha that we're doing now, are like this expansive one that we're doing now. So it's I think a very serious consideration to think about. And our rabbis understand it as follows, that the reason that there's essentially no direct listing or affirmation of the notion of Olam Haba in the Tanakh is because we don't want people living for that. We want people living here in the now.
The author doesn't want.
Excuse me, yes.
Right?
Thank you.
Not
excellent.
we.
Excellent,
Right?
excellent. Yes, you're absolutely right. HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want people living for that. Very good, thank you. Doesn't want people living for that. He wants people living right now, in this, in the here, in the now, growing with this, struggling with this, building with this. But wait a second. We don't want it, we're not ignoring it, right? We don't ignore it. True, we don't ignore it. So our rabbis will reference from time to time things that they feel strongly are hinting to this. Because you could say, like Serene described very well with the Az Yashir, that we're talking about the altar that Yeshua built then and the altars that we will be building in the future, right? That would be so much simpler. And that would put us directly in line with the Az Yashir. But the rabbis don't go that way. They say, no, Az Yivneh. We're talking about building. Building is different than singing. Building is something more grand, more powerful, more long, more out there. So you don't necessarily have to go with this, but it's important to recognize past, future, have your antenna up looking for it. It's important to know B, that the author, Kadosh Baruch Hu, is being clarified, made a direct point of not mentioning Olam Haba in the Torah. Doesn't want us to be focused on that. Okay, anybody just knock out your background noise. And finally, this specific case is a very important one, and it references the term livnot. So it would have been easier for the rabbis not to say this here, right? Because then we go back up to point one, that we don't reference Olam Haba, the world to come, in the written Torah. It would have been easier to go there, but they don't go there. They want you to know, one second, there are no direct references, but there are inferences, and be aware of the inferences. Good so far? Okay.
That's a double-edged sword, though, without placing too high a value on the reward of the life to come. and then saying, but let's also devalue it, that because there's two ways that people are going to live. They're going to live towards it, or they're going to live in fear of it, of a bad one. But whichever way you slice it, there has to be the existence of something else after this, because it doesn't work otherwise, right?
What if the way to slice it was, I know it's there, and it's in the back of my mind that who I am and what I build and what I say and what I do is there forever and ever and ever. But I don't live that way. I live for the here and now. I live for this moment. I live cherishing every minute of life. I don't live with this, to exaggerate the point and excuse the reference, because it's really an inappropriate reference. Elif Avdei Abdalot, many, many, many distinctions. But whereas, an Arab terrorist will blow himself or herself up in a classroom of Jewish children because they have this thing that this world means nothing, and it's all about what will be.
Right.
So it's an exaggerated and unfair comparison, but I wanted to give you something extreme to just take it back to the idea that, 1 second, don't go too far with that stuff. Live right now. There's a famous argument in the Gemara, one person says that a day in life here is more important than all of Olam Haba. The other important person says a day, so to speak, not days, but in Olam Haba is more important than everything here.
Right.
Well, what do you mean? The first argument is the argument to pay most attention to, that the day in the life here is most important, because it's easy to get lost in that stuff.
Yeah, but to discount this would be to say, and I'm with you, by the way, that this is important and make this great and all, but also then you got to look at somebody saying Adolf Hitler gets away with what he did, right? Is that right? Well, nobody wants to believe that either. So it's a double-edged sword. We want to see our loved ones afterwards. All of that, it's hard to negotiate, to navigate.
Right. Exactly. So we don't want to ignore it.
Right.
We don't want to discount it. We just want to prioritize it. We want to prioritize it.
No, I was going to say, is there no happy medium? Because it doesn't sound like such a bad thing to live your life knowing that there's a way to live to do, I guess, the right thing and ultimately, build yourself up for whatever's to come.
That also, that's the way to see it, I think, also, right? Just here and there. You want this to be good and that to be good.
Right. So tell me what gets lost. Tell me what gets lost if there's a little bit of an extra emphasis on the afterlife. What gets lost? Because excuse me a minute, I have to mute my own wife. It wouldn't be the first time. Just hang on a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Honey, you are officially muted now.
Only on.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that I'm sure there could be a balance between the two, to appreciate and enjoy and work for this life, but also know that your actions should be propelled towards something greater than you.
Exactly. So that's what we do. So now tell me, Rachel, if there was more of let's say it was a 50-50 focus, right? What would happen if there was a 50-50 focus?
I think that's great. That's the right way. 50-50.
No, I think the intent would change of your actions.
And therefore, what would be the practical negatives, Sari, that would come? What would be the practical negatives?
So I'm feeling that like we shouldn't even think about Olam Haba at all. I kind of think like we don't know what Olam Haba like is going to be like, or I kind of think 100% of our thoughts and efforts should be in this world and this life. I don't know. Like, what do you think about that?
No, I think that's the way we're guided, and I'm saying that's the way we're guided, and I want you to answer me why. What is the practical thing? Yes, Serene?
I think that when you're thinking about Olam Haba, you're selling yourself short because you're not growing from your actions. You have different intentions. It's just for the reward, and you're not growing. And then you're like,
what about the other way?
For while you're
What
on
about
this earth.
only thinking about this though? Only thinking about this world, and there's no notion of the world to come. What would
I
that
think
be
that's
like?
okay. That's okay, because otherwise it's almost being selfish when you're thinking about Olam Haba. You're really just thinking about yourself.
I think ultimately, I am to agree with that. I think if you're overly focused on Olam Haba, I think it ends up on the Ben Adam Havero level, on the man-to-man level. I think things happen that, you sort of write off. If this is where isn't where everything is, the minute you start to think it's not where everything is, then you don't put your full heart into it. You don't cry as much. You don't celebrate as much. You don't work as hard. That's the concern. Now, it doesn't mean we ignore it. We certainly don't. It's absolutely real. But the minute we start to sort of move away from an absolute, this moment, this life, this day focus, we're not going to be the same people. We're not
I
going to
agree with that. Ricky, I agree, but I also I have a strong feeling that without the notion or the hint or the subtle possibility that there's reward equal to what we do here, or a punishment somehow that people believe in, whether or not it exists in the afterlife, without that hint, even if it's a tiny drop, I think you would have a lot of
You're
people
right.
who don't behave properly.
Who just be despaired and give up. You're right. And that's why it is part of the mix. But it's 5% of my focus. It's not 50.
Good.
It's not
Okay.
40.
It has to be there though. It has to be suggested.
And that's why the rabbis go out of their way to say, Az yivneh. You don't have to. And to work that hard. Just give me a simple one like Az Yashir, so to speak. Not simple, but give me something like that. But now it also, you need to know that generally speaking, we do not go there in the Chumash and the Tanakh. You need to know directly. And we don't go there directly because even though we want to all keep this level of awareness, obviously, for sure, we don't want it to be anything but a tipping off of where we are, just another touch of where we are. Now, once you say, though, that Az Yivneh means past, world to come, you might go back to Az Yashir and say the same thing. Maybe it's not referencing the songs that the Jewish people will sing in present Jewish experience. Maybe it's actually talking about more than that. And if that's true, then it starts to get even more interesting, because then it would mean that you would pluck out other references like this and attach the same type of connotation to them, which is actually pretty exciting. Now you might go back to Az Yashir and say it's also past and not just future, it's eternity future. Good? Okay. So far we've reminded ourselves about En Mukdam Milcha B'Torah within the broader storyline, which is chronological. There will be direct manipulations of things in order to group things together to teach us something. 2, we were reminded of the past future and teased with the idea that in this case, it's referencing Olam Haba, with the understanding that by design, HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not emphasize Olam Haba, the world to come, in the Tanakh by design, because he wants the focus here, but he doesn't want that to be ignored. Good. Now, the next story, which is a fabulous story in this part of Yehoshua, goes back to something that happened at the time of Yaakov Avinu and his children. And the only way to understand this story, and when I read it again, it's so problematic. And the only way to get there, which happens to be extremely exciting. Hi, Carol, welcome back. The only way to get there is to go back to the Sefer Bereshit, Parashat Vayishlach, and look at something that happened with Yaakov and his sons. So I'm going to tell you the story first, and then we'll go back to Yaakov and his sons. So we have, and many of you probably remember it, Bnei Israel conquer the cities of Yericho and Ai, and then the next city in that path is a city called Giv'on. And remember, these are city-states. They were tribal, and they would call them, a city, but in fact, each one had their king, and they were considered like an entity, a city-state. Okay, so they knocked out the first two. They're ready to go after the Giv'onim. It was less than 10 kilometers from Ai. What do the Giv'onim do? They hear about what's going on, and they put on old clothing, right? Old sacks with holes in them, bread that is already hardened, water bags that are empty and worn out, and they drag themselves into the Israeli camp, and they say that they came from a land very far away. Eretz Rehaka Me'od. They come from a land very far away, and they heard about the greatness of the Jewish God and the military power of the Jewish people, and they want to make peace. And by the way, look at our sacks, look at our worn out shoes, look at our hardened bread, look at our stale food that's almost gone. Based on that, you can certainly see that we came from a place very far away. Right? Right. What do? What does Yoshua and the Zikanim do? What do?
They believe them.
Beautiful. They believe them. Then what do, Serene?
They make peace with them.
Excellent. They break.
Then they find out. Right.
Yeah. Hey, Erwin, we missed you. They break bread with them, and they make a peace treaty with them. Now
they weren't at war with them. There was no threat to these people from far away in the first place.
Exactly.
What did they?
That's right. That's right. Exactly.
Right.
And then it says, "V'pi Hashem lo sha'alu." They didn't ask God about it. How much they have asked God? Erwin, I don't know if you heard. I welcomed you back. Good to see you.
I didn't hear.
How would
Thank
they
you.
have asked God?
Great to be back.
Good. Yoshua was a Navi. He could have turned to God and asked him. Or Elazar Cohen had the Urim Tumim, and he could have turned to God and asked him. They don't do either. Now, little tickler on the side. It says, Vayehi miketz gimel yamim, at the end of 3 days. Come on, what does that sound like? What does it sound like? At the end of 3 days, they realized they were taken. The end of 3 days. Give me the 3 days.
Abraham?
No, Abraham with Yitzchak going to the Akedah, yes?
No, I'm talking
Wasn't
about
it the prep for Matan Torah?
Exactly. The 3 days of prep for Matan Torah and 3 days of prep for
crossing the Yarden also.
Perfect. Crossing the Jordan. Beautiful. And how did we learn the 3-day concept? Erwin, you remember this. How did we learn the 3-day concept?
That was from 3 weeks ago. Yeah.
Yeah. We learned it by saying that when a challenging decision comes,
You need
weigh it. Leave the 3. Day 1, I'm enamored. I'm excited. I'm emotionally connected to the issue. Day 2, I balance out. Day 3, I have objective clarity. The Navi specifically says that they didn't ask God, and after the end of the 3 days, they woke up and realized that the city is 6 miles away. It's right here. Now, let's learn another core element. We have the concept called mekach ta'ut, a faulty transaction. Tell me what mekach ta'ut is. This is another core concept you need to own. What is mekach ta'ut? Faulty transaction. So I'll give you a little background. Its 2 major areas are in buying and selling and in marriages. Those are the 2 primary areas where mekach ta'ut A mistaken transaction will be adjudicated from a halakha perspective, but it could be in anything. In a buy and sell situation, if somebody represented something as new and it was used, for example, then the buyer can come back at any time in the future and say, you misrepresented this item, I want my money back, and according to Jewish law, the money has to be paid back. If there's a blemish or a crack or a break in the thing, in the item, and it wasn't highlighted, again, the person can come back and say, you sold me something in A1 condition, and it's not. So I want my money back. Mekach ta'ut, know the concept. A transaction based on the wrong information. Now, it also holds in a marriage. Let's say a lady was represented to the guy, and the lady was represented as having never been married, for example. And the guy finds out a year later, a month later, a day later, she was married. That's grounds for upending the marriage, because it's mekach ta'ut. There was a level of deception here. And because of the level of deception, the transaction doesn't stick. Good? Now,
Ricky, just a
Yeah.
question. Is the adjudication forgiveness or erase?
erase. The person, the buyer, or the groom, or the bride, whoever was misled, has the right to come before a Jewish court and say, I want this thing annulled. I want my money back. Deal erased.
So it's
It's like an annulment.
there's
An
no
annulment, yeah. Now,
there's no penalty to the fraudster.
there's no penalty to the fraudster. That's a very good question. There's no penalty to the fraudster. Correct. He just has to give the money back. You're right. It's a very nice point. You would think there should be.
Right,
You're right.
yeah, I would think.
It's like
But
it's like when
adjudication-
Yaakov. It's like when
right.
Yaakov with Rachel and Leah. Lavan doesn't get in trouble. He
Right,
just
doesn't get in trouble. Right, doesn't get in trouble in the end. That's right. Now, the Givonim came and misled us, right? They said they were from a faraway country. They brought all this stuff that was all fabricated. None of it was true. And they represented it as having been worn out as a result of their journey. Why didn't the Jewish people say this was a lie? It's mekach ta'ut. I don't have to keep my word. Now,
I
I want to compound the question. Our rabbis say, and Harambam highlights it in his laws on warfare, our rabbis say that the Jewish methodology in warfare is to send 3 proclamations to the nation that might be conquered. Proclamation number 1, they call it Gimel Sefarim. Sefer Rishon, the first book, says, if you are willing to convert and keep by the laws of Akadosh Baruch Hu, you can stay. They don't respond, or they respond no. Book number 2 is, should you want to flee the country, we will allow you to flee unharmed. Book number 3 is, we are coming and we're ready to wage war. Now, our rabbis say that the Givonim probably got those 3 books, just like everybody else got them. So they could have found a way to work this thing out. They could have converted, or they could have just ran away. If they were so afraid, and the Navi explains that they were terrified because of what Bnei Israel had done so far. So they had, A, they misrepresented themselves. B, they had other options to save themselves. They could have waged war, like many of these countries wage war. Right after the story, there are 7 or so nations get together and collectively wage war against Israel, and the Navi described there were so many people in their armies, they covered the land like ants. You couldn't even see the land, right? So they had their options. They didn't take their options. They misrepresented themselves. Why did the Jewish leaders turn to the people who complained angrily about the fact that now this city couldn't be conquered, and the tribe that it should have gone to would not have gotten it, and these people might become a thorn in our side, and they deceived us? Why did the elders come out and say, we swore in the name of God, and we cannot go back on our promise? Mekach ta'ud. You can't have a more obvious example of a misrepresented transaction than this. What do you say?
Because they got duped and they felt it and they knew they did. They could have seen it. They could have asked Hashem. They could have seen it coming, and they let their guard down, and they felt responsible for it. It's their responsibility as much as anybody else's.
You're right, Zeke, but they're going against the Doraita. I forgot to mention that point. They happen to be, not a small thing, going against the Doraita, Sefer Shemot, where Kadosh Baruch Hu is describing to Moshe Rabbeinu what's going to happen when we go into the land of Israel, that you are obligated to wipe out every nation. Now, so what did the elders do? They got duped. They didn't ask God. They swore in the name of God. They had an opportunity, according to Jewish law, to get out. They choose not to, and by not doing so, they are in clear violation of one, probably two, deoraitot, that the land has to be cleared of idol worshippers. And if idol worshippers are left in the land, they will influence the Jewish people, and the Jewish people will be punished. It's at least two deoraitot. Do they get
to go back to the land? Do they get to go back and live there? These
Why not?
people?
In fact,
they
were
don't live
threatened by another nation, and now the Israelites went to protect them.
Oh,
how's that?
All right, yeah.
So talk to me. What do you say?
I got nothing.
Huh?
I got nothing.
You can't see it anymore. It's pitch dark in the backyard. But what do you say?
I have no clue.
All right. So,
like, can I just ask like a dumb question? Like these people, they just wanted to save themselves, right? Like, is that was their goal?
But they could have done it differently. They could have done it differently, but they
like
didn't.
They could have been like, how could they have done it differently? Like,
they could have accepted the terms of Yehoshua by saying that we will convert. In the end, they don't convert, but they become servants to the Beit HaMikdash forever and ever, right? The Sho'avei Mayim Chotavei Etzim. They bring the water and they bring the trees, right? Forever and ever to the Beit HaMikdash. HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Jewish people wanted to keep them close enough so they wouldn't be idol worshippers in the obvious sense. They had the opportunities to do it differently. They chose to deceive. They chose to do it wrong. So the Rashi says something incredible, and that forces the whole issue to come into focus. Rashi, 13th century commentator, brilliant and spectacular, says that based on the pasuk, let me find it, Vayasu gam hema be'orma, and they also came forward in deceitfulness. They went ahead and they made their stuff look old and all that. He says it's referencing the deceitfulness, the gam hema, and them, also they, it's referencing the deceitfulness of Yaakov's sons. Now, the Siftei Zekenim, the one who explains Rashi in the Sefer Yehoshua, goes wild on him. He says, one second, we know that there was a group of Canaanites who came to Moshe Rabbeinu in the desert and pulled the same sketch, and he fell for it. So, v'yasu gam hema, and these Givonites did just like those Canaanim did. Why is Rashi talking about what the Shimon and Levi, the children of Yaakov Avinu, did?
He could have referenced the other guys that did the same thing. Yeah.
Right. It's much more direct. It's much more direct. Serene, why does he reference Yaakov's sons? Let me give you a hint. I'm not asking the question fairly. The commentaries say that the reason that they couldn't negate their commitment is that it would have been Chilul Hashem. And to keep the commitment was a Kiddush Hashem, and sanctifying God's name is more important than any specific halacha. So they don't ask God. They don't wait the 3 days, even though they had been conditioned to do that over and again. They were duped. They have the halachic wherewithal to get out. They don't. And then these people are attacked and they even go defend them. And the language suggests that it's a deja vu all over again to what Moshe Rabbeinu went through, and he kept his promise, even though he was similarly duped. But the Siftei Zekenim says no, and it's breathtaking. He says the following. He says, oh, no. Rashi says that this ain't about Moshe Rabbeinu. Rashi references Yaakov Avinu. What is he referencing? When Yaakov Avinu's children, and we know the story well, go to Shechem, whose father, go to Hamor, whose son, Shechem, rapes Dinah and held her captive, both of which, by the way, are punishable by death under the 7 Noahide laws. So they were justified in what they did. They go to that clan and they tell them, yes, you express, we all know the story, that you want to be part of us. No problem. We're happy to make you a part of us. Circumcise yourselves so you can be like us. And then you will marry our daughters. We'll marry your daughters, this and that and that. And then, as we know, what do? On the 3rd day, which is the day when they were suffering the most, they come and they wipe them out. Right? We all know the story. And what does Yaakov Avinu say at the end? Vayoma Yaakov el Shimon el Levi, achaltem oti navisheni v'yoshev haaretz. You embarrassed me, you degraded me, you destroyed my name vis-a-vis the nations of the land of Israel. Now, what they did was completely appropriate according to the 7 Noahide laws. Forget about that, it's appropriate according to the Torah. They had every right to do it. In fact, the local society have an obligation to adjudicate a kidnapping and a rape, both of which are against the Noahide laws. The 3rd Noahide law they broke is that nobody bothered to adjudicate it. So they had 3 legitimate reasons to go in and wipe them out. Yaakov Avinu gets very angry. And over here, Rashi says that the reason that they didn't break their promise is because they couldn't go back to what Yaakov Avinu did. They had to fix it. So talk to me. What's going on here? What is going on here? What do you say? Huh?
So they should have just went in and wiped them out without duping them, right? Is that that's what you're saying, right?
Perfect.
This is what you did. This is what we're doing back to you. Finish.
Perfect. Exactly. Instead of them saying, in this way, we're going to be nice to you if you will be just like
They wanted
us.
it to be easy for them to wipe them out. They didn't think that it was going to be so easy.
Exactly. That level of deceit is not acceptable. You want to go to war? But what do you mean? They kidnapped Asur, not by the Torah, by the Noahide laws, which they were bound to. Raped, Asur, never adjudicated. He held her for weeks, months, whatever it was. They'd never adjudicated the case. They have every right. And by the way, the punishment for violating a Noahide law is death. And you don't have to go to a court, right? It's barbaric, it's ancient. So they had 3 reasons to take revenge. But the fact that they did it by duping them, Yaakov Avinu says, no way, unacceptable. Go to war with them and take them out. But to tell them by doing such and such, you will be part of us, and then attacking them, unacceptable. That Yaakov Avinu suggests might be a Chilul Hashem. So over here, what would have happened? They would have gone and wiped them out. And what would people have said? What would people have said? What do you say?
In the Yehoshua case or in the Yaakov case? Which one are we
In the
talking about?
Yaakov case, we know what they said. We know
Right.
that nobody understood it. That was Yaakov's great fear, right?
They're gonna say the same thing. They can't trust the Jews.
Ah, perfect. They're going to say the same thing. You can't trust the Jews. 1 second. The Jews are not a trustworthy people. That's a Chilul Hashem. That's a
Gotcha.
desecration of God's name. So I'm going to be duped. I'm going to let you lie to me, knowing that when the dust clears and for on and on through eternity, people will not hear this whole story. And people will misinterpret. And because we have the problem of Yaakov Avinu, they're going to misjudge us. Now, which suggests very strongly that that's the problem. And that's why Rashi mentions it. If we didn't have the Yaakov Avinu challenge, we wouldn't have a problem here. So because they have that reference point, even though they're wrong, those people should have been wiped out, but not duped. Wipe them out. Don't con them. But since that is a glaring event in ancient world history, and it will be referenced, the Zikanim came back and said, no, we can't do it, and we're going to keep our word.
Right, because otherwise you're gonna fuel the flames of the Jews aren't trustworthy people from way back then.
Now, you can't trust them no matter what. Now, 1 second. He did the wrong thing to me. It's true. But in a private circumstance, if somebody sold you the wrong thing, you have every right to protect your own assets and your family and to get your money back. But when it comes to a public thing, particularly something on a grand scale, the other consideration of Kiddush Hashem has to be the primary consideration. And it's just remarkable in this case how, despite the fact that there was out and out deception, despite the fact that there was a premise to go after them, and that they were violating at least 2 biblical commandments by not wiping them out, they decide to go with that. And it tells you again, when you go to the concept of the flow between all of the elements of Torah, and again, this is one of the things that is so important for all of us to hold and to, the mitzvot of wiping out the nations is in Sefer Bereshit, Sefer Shemot. The story of Moshe with the thing was much later on, B'midbar, Devarim. The story of Yaakov Avinu and his children in that circumstance is in Sefer Bereshit, Parashat Vayishlach. So the way to get it all is to touch it all, is to be able to touch it all. So, we don't learn Sefer Yehoshua, we don't learn Sefer Bereshit, we learn the whole package. And that's part of what we're doing, all of us together, is as we build through the Navi, God willing, we will constantly go back and reference and connect the dots wherever possible, because that's the only way it's supposed to be learned. Good? Any other thoughts on any of the points you mentioned?
Yeah, Rick, I want to go back to the 3-day deal.
Yeah.
So I wanted in other words, where does that come from? Again, could you bring me up to date? I have a comment.
So Serene, you want to answer Erwin on that? Let Serene take care of it. I'm quiet.
Serene's champ, yeah. Go ahead.
I was saying about waiting the 3 days to actually make a decision. Is that what
where's
you're
it
asking about?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't remember what the source of it, but I know that we said it's
No,
the first
I know
day.
the drill, but I'm saying where do we bring it down from?
I'll tell you.
I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
No, the actual 3 days comes from the Matan Torah, the prep for the Matan Torah, but I don't know if that's exactly, where we get that idea that
Well,
we're,
it really essentially is, it's the 3 days, as Zeke mentioned with Abraham and Yitzhak, 3 days. Imagine Abraham being tortured for 3 days, thinking about his son being murdered and him doing the murdering. It's 3 days again with Matan Torah, with giving of the Torah, and 3 days again in preparation for the splitting of the thing, of the Jordan. So we see over and again the same 3 days, it's never more, and we see the same 3 days. And the idea is that when these events happen, Kadosh Baruch Hu wants them to happen with an individual who's objective. So the idea is that by the 3rd day, Avraham Avinu was able to think as clearly as he could possibly think under those circumstances. But the God had a real concern, and he was right, that the Jewish people were so overwhelmed with his might and power and miracles that they were accepting the Torah by being overwhelmed and not objectively accepting it. So let's take it 3 days. Let's calm down. Let's think. Let's prepare. Let's separate and just, but in that case, in the case of Matan Torah, it didn't work. Because in fact, we hold that the Midrash says, as we all know, Kafa alehem har kigigit. The Jewish people accepted the Torah at that point by being overwhelmed by God's might, and don't properly accept it until the time of Purim. In terms of the splitting of the Jordan, you have the same thing. And it teaches us that, don't put a person in that place where, many of us have strong dynamic personalities or strong positions in a certain situation. And to get people to go along with what we want, a lot of us can push and sort of get that done pretty easily. But it teaches the restraint on both sides of the conversation. If the consideration is mine vis-a-vis somebody else, I want to take the time. And if I'm the one with that heavy hand, I don't want the person to decide right away. I want the person to think. I want the person to weigh. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu continually uses this concept. And over here, the Torah, the Navi goes out of his way to mention that they didn't think about it. They didn't ask God, and they didn't even think, you don't want to ask God, okay. But they didn't even think about it. They just jumped.
Ricky, so the reason I brought it up was because I just recently finished the book that was written about 10 years ago. You might know who it is. Daniel Kahneman. He's a famous Israeli psychologist.
Yeah.
So if you never read it, you should. I wanted to read it because, I read a lot, but for 10 years, I wanted to pick it up, and I finally read it. So he's now in his 80s. He just wrote a book called Noise. It's going to be like a bit, but you should read. It's called Thinking Fast, Slow.
Oh, Thinking Fast and Slow. I've heard that. Yeah.
Right. So I always wanted to read it. It's like 400 or 500 pages. I said, I'm not a psychologist, but I said, I have to read it because it's mind blowing. And I just finished it. But the 3-day thing is a reference. I'm not comparing to Torah, but it's sort of the gut. He calls it, I'll just give you the snapshot, system 1, system 2. System 1 is react, go with gut, do what you got to do. And system 2 is the 3-day or more deal. And he goes through 400 or 500 pages. It could blow your mind. I mean, you'll love it. It's amazing.
What's his last name?
Daniel Kahneman. He's an Israeli psychologist, born in Israel psychologist. He's world renowned. And he just wrote a book called Noise.
Nice.
But what do you think of just from
So what does he say, Owen? How long does he say to wait? What's his timeline?
It depends on the situation, but there is a system 1, system 2 where you react from gut, or you go not your way, but it said the 3-day or more way. And it's sort of like if you ever read the book Blink from Gladwell.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. But the interesting thing is it's a coin toss because, like you said, it didn't work here, the 3-day deal, or it's somewhere. So really, does the gut versus the 3 days?
Well, over here they didn't work. They didn't hold the 3 days. In this case, they didn't hold the 3 days.
Oh, they didn't
I want to speak more deliberately to your point. None of us always wait 3 days. None of us do. It wouldn't be normal. It wouldn't be practical, right? So Because I think this is where you're going. And first of all, I jotted down the name and I'm going to pick up the book, but I think this is where you're going. It's not always practical to wait the 3 days, right? Not always practical. Doesn't make sense. We can't live
You
that
have to
way.
restrain yourself too. Yeah.
Right. So let's qualify the types of cases that we're talking about here. What
Okay.
is it? And maybe you can reference some of his criteria that he brings, because I'd love to hear about that. I'll qualify it from this end as I understand it, and I'd love to hear your understanding of how he would frame this type of thing. So when do we wait the 3 days? When there's either an overwhelming element to the consideration, overwhelming, something just, like a splitting of the sea, so to speak, on our level, or there's a very substantial emotional tug to it. So in those two cases, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells us, wait the 3 days. Now, if it's not either of those, then it's a normal decision-making process, right? But if there's a risk that I'm overwhelmed by these extraordinary events going on, right? The shock and awe that's going on around me, or I'm so emotionally connected to the situation that I can't clear out my objective thought processes, then the idea is to wait 3 days. But if it's a normal decision where I'm instinctually responding, or I'm in my experience zone, my comfort zone, I don't need 3 minutes.
Oh, no, but so then you don't have to just sit. If you got the decision after an hour, you don't have to go to 72 hours.
I could do it in 5 minutes, in a minute. The thing is, and I'd love to hear how he qualifies these things, but the thing here is, when there's a shock and awe element to it, which happens sometimes, there's a shock and awe element. There's something overwhelming. Pause. There's something very, very emotional. Pause. But if it's a standard decision, we make them all the time, and we make them quickly, and we should.
Right. So when you say shock and awe, Ricky, you're saying if somebody right then and there just now witnessed some really an atrocity, like a really bad thing happening right in front of him. Now, if you went and told them, Judge, right now, what do we do to this person who did this bad thing? He doesn't have to say right now. The guy's not going anywhere. They've caught him. He's reprimanded. You could wait 3 days, get some perspective, or you could decide right now, you're going to decide based on how you feel, kill the guy. I mean, whatever he did, he deserves to die. Right. So I think that's what you mean, right? In that moment.
And the shock and awe could be that moment, or it could be a collective, a series of events.
But if there's a charging rhinoceros coming at you, and you don't have the chance to think, do I kill it?
And you know what? And to your point is, and I think this is what Erwin is trying to say, is that, thank God we reach a point in our lives where we know a lot, we've been, and when we're comfortable in our own skin and living the life that we want to live, true to the core values that we want to be true to, then more and more becomes instinctual. It could be a shock and awe thing that minute or that day, and it could be a cumulative a series of shock and awe events like Bnei Israel experienced that just preclude you from making a decision that's a good one, that's a clear one, that's an objective one. But on the other hand, and I hope I'm understanding, Erwin, what you might be referencing, on the other hand, we know that when someone is in his or her zone, if your zone is learning, chesed, family, whatever, and you're really engaged in those areas, you become Baal Etzah. They say that, when someone turns 50, if they're living true to their core values and immersed in them and spending time in them, they become excellent decision makers and relatively quick decision makers because they have the experience and they have the clarity of identity. So we're talking about the 3 days when those things are overwhelmed by something else or some things else. That's what we're talking about here. In this case, they were duped. And the commentaries go very far and they say, you know what? They weren't even professional dupers. They weren't. They were very simple. They were amateurs. And despite the fact that they were amateurs, they pulled it off. But the point that it references something that happened hundreds of years before. And that's still in the world consciousness from our perspective. Even if the world is not a nice place, we still have to be aware of these things and aware that people may connect the dots. Now, you can't get lost with this because then we'll never be able to defend ourselves properly, right? But the sensitivity to it and the connection back is important to consider. And
So Ricky, I'm going to read you two things from the book. The
okay.
System one functions. This is just one line of 100 pages on system one.
Okay.
But system one functions. Jumping to conclusions is efficient if the conclusions are likely to be correct and the cost of an occasional mistake acceptable, and if the jumps saves much time and effort. That's one.
Yeah.
But the key word he uses also is this word here, which is like, I threw it into my my repertoire. The technical definition of heuristic. Have you ever heard of the word HEURISTIC? Is a simple procedure that helps find adequate, though often imperfect, answers to difficult question. The word comes from the root of eureka. So he says that it's okay if on the surface that you got the facts, like you said, you're good. So go for it. The system two was the second part of the book where he goes through that whole, you do your stuff, you go through the thing, you weigh it out, but it's really at the end of the day, I don't know. Does it really refer back to gut?
I think the gut, from what I understand and what I think he's referencing in this first case that you read, is meant to be trusted when the circumstances allow it to think clearly.
Right.
And then you can have a quick response, and you should have a quick response.
Right.
When somebody is being compromised, when something is overwhelming, when something is daunting, when something is, then we shouldn't be in that place.
Right.
Can I ask a question? Like, is there a chance that B'nai Israel knew that these guys were con artists, or were lying, and they just quickly, like what Erwin said, they made a quick decision and they said, you know what, let's just not make war with these people, and it's better, if they just, hang out with us. Is that a possibility?
It would be, but for the fact that you see a very strange thing happening here. You see the people coming to challenge the elders and Yehoshua on their decision and saying that they were very unhappy about it and they thought that they made the wrong decision. So it seems that, the people were extremely angry about it and demanded of them to retract their decision, and they say they can't. He says that they came to them and the people come and they're extremely angry, and they demand that they abrogate the commitment, and then the Nesiim come back and they say, we can't kill them, but we will enslave them because they did wrong to us. So there's a Chidu Hashem if we kill them, but we will make them the water bearers and the tree laborers to bring the wood to the Beit HaMikdash forever. So it's hard to say that they knew what was going on and agreed to it. If that was true, I don't think the Navi would go out of its way to say that the people were angry and demanded that they retract the decision. Good.
Right.
All right. Any other thoughts? All right. Next week, the sun stops in the middle of the sky. The first and only time in our Jewish history where man takes control of God's world, makes a demand, and it happens. Never happened before, to our knowledge, and never happened again. So Hashemesh B'Giv'on Dom is something that is a one-time spectacular event. And we have to get an understanding on how HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kiv'yachol allows Yehoshua to take his world order and stop it. So anybody who has a few minutes to have a look at it, it's in the 10th Perek or so, 11th Perek of 9th, 10th, 11th chapter of Yehoshua, and it should be nice. We'll go through it together. Any other thoughts, questions?
Good.
We're good?
Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Thank
Erwin,
Thank you, Ricky.
I'm going to
Thank
look.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank
Have a
you.
good one.
Everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.